Paris, February 5th, 1997. The pool at the Hôtel Ritz is usually cleared for her by 4 in the afternoon. She's 76 years old, the United States Ambassador to France, and she swims here most days the same way she does everything, with total, concentrated attention. The day before, she'd flown to England for her great-granddaughter's christening, ridden horses, flown back. That's just how she operates. The staff at the Ritz knows this. Half of official Paris knows this. And then she collapses in the water, and they pull her out, and 3 days after that, she's dead. France will posthumously give her the Grand Cross of the Légion d'honneur. Bill Clinton will deliver her eulogy at Washington National Cathedral. Madeleine Albright will describe her as not a woman to let the century pass her by. The obituaries will use words like trailblazer and Kingmaker and, inevitably, courtesan. She's been called the greatest courtesan of her era since at least the 1940s. Biographers, journalists, even the people who loved her, they all reach for that word eventually. Sally Bedell Smith, who wrote the most exhaustive account of her life, put it plainly. She lived as a courtesan, in the precise, centuries-old definition. Sonia Purnell, whose 2024 biography, Kingmaker, draws on newly released interviews, called her the most powerful courtesan in history on the cover. These weren't insults. They were intended as compliments, which is exactly the problem. Because the label flattens into bedroom gossip what was, by any honest accounting, one of the most sophisticated political careers of the 20th century, and it conveniently excuses everyone from asking what it cost her to build it. Her name was Pamela Beryl Digby. Born January 20th, 1920, to the 11th Baron Digby, aristocratic in name, cash-poor in practice. Her father and brother sat in the House of Lords. The money had not kept pace with the title. She grew up knowing exactly which room she was entitled to enter, and precisely how little she had to do it with. That awareness, forged in English country houses where status was everything, and assets were quietly dwindling, seems to have sharpened in her something that biographers consistently describe as great shrewdness, exercised from an early age. She did immense amounts of homework on every person who mattered to her. She wasn't performing interest, she was building a database, one conversation at a time, and she started before she was 20. In October 1939, Pamela Digby married Randolph Churchill. She was 19, he was 28, the son of Winston Churchill, and already, by the accounts of everyone who knew him, a spectacular mess. Heavy drinker, erratic temper, dissolute by multiple biographers' descriptions. The marriage was in trouble almost immediately. Their son, Winston Spencer Churchill, was born in October 1940, approximately 2 days after Randolph took his seat in the House of Commons. The timing of everything in her life, even then, had a way of being meaningful. What the marriage actually gave her had nothing to do with Randolph. It gave her a father-in-law, who became Prime Minister in May 1940, and a room at 10 Downing Street. Winston Churchill moved Pamela into Downing Street when he took office, and she became, in short order, the person he played bezique with until 5 in the morning when he couldn't sleep, which was often, in 1940, with the Blitz overhead and England fighting alone. She understood something fundamental about Churchill that his own children sometimes didn't. What he needed after the decisions was company, not analysis. She gave him that, and in exchange, she was given access to the most consequential war council in the English-speaking world at the most decisive moment of the century. Here's where the courtesan framing starts to come apart. In late March 1941, Pamela was placed next to Pamela Harriman at a dinner hosted for Adele Astaire. Harriman had just arrived in London at age 49 as Franklin Roosevelt's Lend-Lease representative, the man responsible for channeling American military aid to Britain. The seating arrangement wasn't accidental. Churchill and Lord Beaverbrook, his Minister of Aircraft Production and press baron, had, according to multiple biographical sources including Purnell, explicitly used Pamela as what they called a bedroom spy. Beaverbrook knew their affair could only help the cause, as she ferried information between the circles that mattered. Harriman was carrying American policy in his briefcase. Getting him deeply, personally invested in Britain's survival was a strategic objective. Pamela was the instrument of that investment. Their affair began during a devastating Luftwaffe raid. The context is almost too symbolic to sit with comfortably, and the next morning they were seen crossing Horse Guards Parade together. FDR's personal envoy, Harry Hopkins, before Harriman left for London, had reportedly tipped him off that Pamela had more information than anyone in England. An Oxford academic journal on wartime diplomacy confirmed that she played a key role in converting the 49-year-old Harriman into a zealous pro-Britain advocate. Simultaneously, she was sleeping with CBS broadcaster Edward R. Murrow, who was explaining the war to American radio audiences every night. When Murrow took to the airwaves to make the case for Britain, she was helping shape what he said. He came close to leaving his wife and their baby to marry her. He didn't, ultimately, one of several men who would promise marriage and then reverse course. But during those months, information flowed through her in multiple directions, from Churchill's inner circle outward, from the American diplomatic world back in, shaped and contextualized by a 21-year-old woman who had no official title whatsoever. Purnell documents that Pamela had advanced knowledge of the Normandy invasion. She was, according to William Walton's documentation, the only person in London to receive 3 separate letters from 3 separate participants at Yalta. By 1944, she wasn't a socialite who happened to be married into a good family. She was an intelligence node. Randolph Churchill discovered the Harriman affair in spring 1941 and was, by all accounts, incandescent. His relationship with his father, the man who had tacitly approved the arrangement, or at minimum looked the other way, would never recapture the intimacy they had enjoyed before the war. The price of Pamela's wartime usefulness landed not on her, but on the marriage she was already exiting, and on the man who'd been, as Purnell describes, merely dissolute before this particular humiliation. Clementine Churchill, who referred to Pamela in family diaries as spam, appears to have tolerated the situation for the same reason she tolerated most things, because Winston needed it. By the mid-1940s, the marriage was over. Averell Harriman had departed London for Moscow in 1943, leaving Pamela with what she later described as a feeling of vulnerability and solitude. The divorce from Randolph came through in the mid-1940s. Sources conflict on whether it was 1945 or 1946. Either way, she was in her mid-20s, the mother of a son named Winston, daughter-in-law to the Prime Minister of England, and formally attached to nothing. In 1948, she moved to Paris. She arrived, by her own account, with very little money. She took a job briefly as a Paris correspondent for the Daily Express under Lord Beaverbrook, the same man who had once pointed her toward Harriman like a guided instrument. She was looking, according to Sonia Purnell, for someone to support her and her young son. What she found was a decade-long education in European power, extracted from the men who held it, in exchange for herself. First, Gianni Agnelli, heir to the Fiat automobile empire, a year younger than Pamela, an Italian playboy who was simultaneously conducting affairs with multiple Hollywood actresses. Their romance lasted 5 years, beginning in 1948. She converted to Catholicism for him. She organized his life, made his homes run beautifully, absorbed Italian industrial culture and the aesthetics of serious European money. The relationship ended without marriage. Agnelli eventually married Mirella Caracciolo. Pamela got an education in what European aristocratic wealth actually looked like from the inside. The art, the architecture, the way serious men thought about power across generations, and she paid for it with 5 years and her religion. Then Prince Ali Khan, son of the Aga Khan, at whose Riviera villa she became hostess. It was here she met Kathleen and Jack Kennedy. Then Baron Ely de Rothschild, the French banker, whose jealousy was demonstrated concretely by his wife sideswiping her car into Pamela's on a Paris boulevard. Then Stavros Niarchos, the Greek shipping magnate, before she finally left Europe altogether. Sally Bedell Smith summarized this decade with a precision that reads as both admiring and devastating. Pamela's life demonstrates how she used the only tools available to ambitious women of her generation. She wasn't endowed with the wealth to support the grand life to which she aspired. She had charm, intelligence, the Churchill name, and the ability to make each man feel like the most interesting person in any room. She gave all of it repeatedly, and what she received in return was access. Access to art, languages, cultural sophistication, and the internal architecture of European power. She became fluent in French. She accumulated Renoirs. She learned how serious money worked. She understood by the time she left Paris how to be genuinely useful to a powerful man rather than merely decorative. What she didn't acquire was her own name. She was still Pamela Churchill. The Churchill connection, biographer Smith noted explicitly, had material worth. It opened doors that a divorced English nobody couldn't have opened alone. Her son Winston was approximately 7 or 8 years old when she moved to Paris. Who raised him during the years she was managing the households of Agnelli and Rothschild isn't clearly documented. What is documented is that he harbored resentment toward her for inattentive mothering during his childhood, and that the mother-son relationship had always been fraught. The price of the Paris years wasn't charged to Pamela's account. It was charged to Winston's. In 1960, at age 40, she married Leland Hayward in New York. Hayward was 58, one of the most successful Broadway producers of his era. South Pacific, Gypsy, The Sound of Music on Stage, The Spirit of St. Louis on film. The marriage is the most overlooked chapter of her biography, which is a mistake because it's the bridge. Through Hayward, she entered American theatrical and media culture, met the New York democratic infrastructure, and began building the American social network that would eventually become something far more serious. She moved from kept woman of the European elite to participant in American public life, all in the same decade that American life was transforming around her. Hayward suffered a stroke and declined. Pamela managed his care through his deterioration and his death on March 5, 1971. That part of the story, the quiet, unglamorous work of caring for a dying man, tends to get lost in the more spectacular narrative. But it was real, and it matters, because it complicates the purely strategic reading of her. She sat with him through the decline. 6 months later, she married again. Brooke Hayward, Leland's daughter from his marriage to actress Margaret Sullivan, didn't see caretaking. She saw something else. In a Time magazine article, she said, "Pam didn't do me any great favors as a stepmother. She's greedy beyond the usual human greed." The conflict over Hayward family assets is documented without specific dollar figures in available sources, but the pattern, Pamela's relations with stepchildren souring over money, was already established before the Harriman years made it famous. On September 27, 1971, 6 months after Hayward's death, Pamela married W. Averell Harriman. He was 79, she was 51. The age gap was 30 years. The man was the former governor of New York, FDR's wartime ambassador to the Soviet Union, Secretary of Commerce under Truman, and one of the foundational architects of post-war American foreign policy. They had been lovers for roughly 2 years in wartime London, 30 years earlier. They had reconnected after the death of his second wife Marie in 1970, and whatever else the relationship was, it appears to have been substantive. Harriman gave Pamela in Vanity Fair's description, an education in liberal politics. She gave him, in his final 15 years, a partner who understood power at the level he'd spent his life exercising it. He arranged, as one source records, for her to become an American citizen, described as a gift to Harriman. She took his name, and this time the name was worth exactly what she needed it to be worth. Averell Harriman died on July 26, 1986, at 94. His estate was valued at $65 to $66 million. Pamela inherited a substantial portion directly, was named executor, and received controlling interest in an estate that Vanity Fair, accounting for art collection valuations, estimated at roughly $115 million in late 1986. She sold portions of the Marie Harriman art collection in the late 1980s. She had Renoirs. She had properties. She had, for the first time in her life, something she'd never had before. Money that was legally hers, and a name that carried 50 years of American political history behind it. She'd already been building toward what came next. After Ronald Reagan demolished the Democratic Party in the landslide of 1980, Pamela founded Democrats for the 80s, immediately and enduringly known as PAMPAC. The New York Times confirmed its founding in a 1982 profile with the headline, "Pamela Harriman, the Power Broker." She used Harriman's money and her own inherited resources to build what amounted to the Democratic Party's surviving infrastructure during the Reagan years. She built the Harriman Communications Center. She began hosting issue dinners at her Georgetown home. These weren't cocktail parties. They were policy briefings disguised as dinner parties, attended by senior Democratic politicians and future cabinet members. She would invite prospective donors, brief them on policy, give them access to serious political figures, and extract both funding and commitment. One party insider, unnamed in available sources, described it as the most effective political organization I know of within our party. The Washington Post would later observe that political decisions get made at Georgetown suppers. Hers were the suppers in question. She was among the first Washington insiders to back Bill Clinton when, as one source put it, Washington was still writing him off as a country boy. She'd assessed him as early as 1980, approved of his brains, charm, confidence, and interest in policy, and had been introducing him to the Washington power structure for over a decade before he ran for president. A single fundraiser she hosted at her Middleburg, Virginia estate in 1992 raised more than $3 million for his campaign in one day. Clinton later said, with characteristic bluntness, that had she not decided who would be president, Bill Clinton wouldn't have been president. The irony of the PAMPAC achievement sits right at the center of her story, and it deserves to be held without resolution. Her most independent act was funded by an inherited male fortune, operated through her ability to make powerful men feel important in a room she owned, and built on a name she'd acquired through marriage. She was doing real, consequential political work that helped determine which party governed the most powerful country on earth for years, and she was doing it using the same mechanism she'd always used. The rooms were hers. The currency was still male proximity and male money. That's not a condemnation. It's an accounting. Clinton nominated her as United States Ambassador to France on March 23, 1993. No documented Senate objections on reputation grounds appear in the historical record. She sailed through confirmation. Washington, per the LA Times at the time, had assumed since election night that the widow of W. Averell Harriman was in line for a top diplomatic post. The appointment was understood as political reward, and it was. But what happened in Paris wasn't a reward. It was the most demanding and, by all serious accounts, the most genuine chapter of her professional life. She was fluent in French. She had been navigating French social and cultural life since 1948. She knew how the Élysée Palace worked, how French intellectual culture processed American policy, and how to use a dinner table as a diplomatic instrument in ways that most career diplomats learn only after a decade in the Foreign Service. Madeleine Albright, who served as UN ambassador during the same period, described her as not a woman to let the century pass her by. Her colleague Swanee Hunt, the U.S. ambassador to Austria, was described as Harriman's close friend and counterpart, suggesting a network of women at the ambassadorial level working in genuine coordination. The American embassy in Paris became, under her tenure, a genuinely significant cultural and diplomatic venue. She managed U.S.-France relations through the first Clinton term, through Euro-Disney controversies, through the ongoing negotiations of the post-Cold War European order. And while she was doing all of this, she was simultaneously being sued in federal court. In September 1994, 16 months into her ambassadorship, Averell Harriman's daughters filed a federal lawsuit in New York. The core allegation was that approximately $30 million in family trust funds had been squandered through catastrophic mismanagement, with Pamela as trustee. The numbers are specific and damning. In 1989, roughly $21 million of trust assets were invested in the Seasons Resort and Conference Center at Great Gorge, New Jersey. The resort had previously been a Playboy club. It failed. On March 26, 1991, Pamela personally guaranteed an $18 million credit line at Morgan Guarantee Bank, apparently without the heir's knowledge. By the time the lawsuit was filed, trust assets described in one court filing had become, in effect, I owe us from Pamela to the trust she was supposed to protect. Co-defendants included Clark Clifford, former Secretary of Defense under Lyndon Johnson, 87 years old at time of filing, already politically damaged by the BCCI banking scandal, and Paul Warnke, former head of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. Her lawyer's defense strategy was essentially this: she knew little of where the money was going and was just signing things that the estate administrator told her to sign. The woman who had once been described as having more information than anyone in England, who had managed the most sophisticated political operation in the Democratic Party, was being defended on the grounds that she was a figurehead who didn't understand her own fiduciary responsibilities. A tentative $20 million settlement was reached in June 1995, then collapsed when Clifford and Warnke refused to pay an additional $3 million. Pamela's own negotiating position, as stated by her lawyers, was that she intended to maintain a net worth of at least $10 million and an annual income. She offered to restore $4.7 million to the Harriman Foundation. The heirs said no. A second action had been filed separately in Loudoun County, Virginia, covering 4 Virginia trusts worth $18.5 million. The final settlement was reached on December 31, 1995, while she was still serving as ambassador. The terms were confidential. What sources document is that it involved mutual redistribution of family assets, that she was forced to sell key items from her art collection, and that she emerged with roughly $10 million in net worth, a fraction of what she'd inherited 9 years earlier. After the settlement, she reportedly had approximately $3 million in liquid cash, with at least half pledged as collateral. The woman who had once been worth over $100 million, by some estimates, had spent 9 years simultaneously running the Democratic Party's infrastructure and hemorrhaging the estate that funded it. The bill for the title of Pamela Harriman, Power Broker, arrived, and it arrived as a federal lawsuit from 2 old women who just wanted the money their father had left them. There's a particular cruelty in the timing. She was a sitting U.S. ambassador being sued in a Manhattan courtroom by her late husband's children, and she couldn't resign because resigning would have confirmed everything the lawsuit implied. So she continued giving dinners at the American Embassy. She continued representing the United States at official functions. The French government, watching all of this, appears to have been unperturbed. Whatever private chaos was being adjudicated in New York, what they saw in Paris was an ambassador who could talk to their president, understood their culture, spoke their language, and made the American embassy feel like a place worth attending. She described herself, in one of the few direct self-characterizations that survived into the record, as basically a backroom girl. The line is either the most telling thing she ever said or the most carefully constructed. She said it at a moment when she was arguably the most publicly powerful woman in Democratic Party politics. The woman who had shaped every room she'd ever entered was claiming, with apparent sincerity, that she preferred to work from behind. Sonia Purnell, drawing on newly released recordings of interviews Pamela gave before her death, documents a loneliness that the public record studiously conceals. The real Pamela, Purnell argues, bore only superficial resemblance to the public image. The book notes she experienced estrangement or strained relationships with seemingly all of her children and stepchildren, Winston Jr.'s resentment over her inattentive mothering, Brooke Hayward's public contempt, the Harriman heirs' lawsuit. Purnell describes her as lonely, despite the hours she spent every day in social events, and as someone who hated being alone. She was almost never physically alone. She had staff, diplomatic duties, social engagements that ran from breakfast to midnight. What she was, in the way that matters, was isolated. The way people who operate entirely through strategic relationships are always isolated. Nobody in those rooms was simply her friend, and she likely knew it. She never appears to have pushed back against the courtesan label, on the record. No interview contains a documented objection to the term. What she was, Purnell notes, was most envious of Eddie's masculine privilege. Most envious, among all her lovers, of Murrow's ability to simply announce himself as important. He could say things. He could be on record. His influence had a byline. Hers had to work through bedrooms and dinner tables and the careful cultivation of men who would then go out and do the publicly attributable thing. She understood what she'd traded, even if she'd never said it directly. Her son Winston signed the inheritance papers for her estate within a month of her death. She'd drawn up her will approximately 1 month before she died, leaving the bulk of what remained, roughly $10 million in homes, property, and jewels, to him and his estranged wife. The relationship between them had always been fraught, but the will suggests something more complicated than simple estrangement. At the end, she gave him what was left. He took it. The day before her death, she had ridden horses in England at her great-granddaughter's christening, then flown back to Paris. She was 76. She didn't pace herself. She had not, in any documented chapter of her life, ever paced herself. And on February 5, 1997, she died in the pool at the Hôtel Ritz, in the city where she had arrived 49 years earlier with very little money and the name of a man she was in the process of leaving. Clinton eulogized her with the line about the London Blitz. When her train was bombed twice at age 21, she simply brushed off the shards of glass, picked herself up, and went to the office to do her work. He called her truly indomitable. France gave her the Grand Cross of the Légion d'honneur posthumously. The cathedral in Washington filled with people who had, at various points in the preceding 60 years, been useful to her, or been made to feel useful by her, which in Washington amounts to the same category. What did it mean to do what she did? Born in 1920 to a cash-poor English baron, with a title worth less than nothing, and no profession available to her that wasn't marriage, British aristocratic women of her era expressed political power, as one academic study of the period concluded, through exactly 4 channels: as social patron, patronage distributor, political advisor, and political electioneer, all of them mediated through men. She used all four with a consistency and ambition that no man in her life matched. She did it across 6 decades, 3 continents, and 4 names. The men who called her a courtesan weren't entirely wrong. She did sell something: attention, intelligence, the organizing principle of a household, in exchange for access and resources. But the framing misses the direction of the trade. She wasn't purchasing pleasure. She was purchasing an education, a network, a set of rooms, a platform, and ultimately, a title that no one could take back: Ambassador Harriman. The United States of America's official representative to the Republic of France. She arrived in Paris in 1948 as a kept woman navigating someone else's city. She died in Paris in 1997 as the sovereign representative of the most powerful government on earth. In between, she gave up her son's childhood, her financial security, her independence, and every version of herself that might have been simpler and smaller and her own. She died celebrated, and she died lonely, and she died at the top of the world in a pool that had been cleared specifically for her, in a hotel she'd first visited as someone else's guest. Was it worth it? She never answered that question on the record. The will she signed a month before she died left everything to the son who resented her, which might be the closest thing to an answer she was willing to give. Subscribe for more stories like this.